Hi everyone, it's Leela from Miss Kiss Creations. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to show you how I apply my epoxy onto my tumblers. I am working with a smaller tumbler. This is a 12-ounce wine koozie. I did purchase this tumbler from the Stainless Steel Depot, and I did do the tack it method on this tumbler. So I have my epoxy all mixed, and like in my epoxy mix tutorial, you are going to be needing your heat gun as well. Okay, so make sure you have your heat gun handy and close to you. I also like to have baby wipes on hand. This is if something gets on my skin or anything, I can quickly grab some baby wipes and wipe it off. And I also have my silicone mat. A lot of y'all, if you don't know, epoxy sticks to everything and cures to everything except for silicone. So this is epoxy that I mixed earlier and it just peeled right off. So if you do not have the silicone mat, you need to go get one ASAP, and I'll go ahead and post that link in my description below on where to purchase that. I'm going to go ahead and hit my epoxy with my heat gun. If you can see, I'm recording my videos back to back, so this is the same batch of epoxy that I mixed whenever I made my how to mix epoxy tutorial. So you see there's hardly any bubbles. It's been sitting for a couple minutes. So I'm going to heat it up just a little bit. And then I'm going to go ahead and just pour it on my tumbler. Now I mixed 2 tablespoons of epoxy, and I'm not going to use all of this on this tumbler. The leftover epoxy, I'll go ahead and just use it in a mold. So I have my tumbler here, and all I do is I drizzle the epoxy onto the tumbler, and then I just spread it around on my finger. There's no rhyme or reason the way that I do this. You can spread it up and down, you can spread it left and right. To me, it doesn't matter because at the end, I'm just going to even it all out. So what I like to do so I avoid dripping is I let the tumbler move towards or away from me, so towards y'all, towards the camera, and then I drizzle it on the tumbler, and then I catch it with my glove, and then I swirl it around on the tumbler. I found that to be the easiest way to apply the epoxy on tumblers for me. And of course, I'm using a gloved hand. I find that method a lot easier as well. And with this tumbler, what I'll probably do is I'll apply decal. So I'm gonna go ahead and place this epoxy on this tumbler. Wait 24 hours, because I always wait 24 hours before I apply decal. And then I will go ahead and re-epoxy it as well. And then the tumbler should be finished. If it has some spots in it that looks that it's not completely finished, like any fish eyes or air bubbles or anything, go ahead and just apply another coat of epoxy on, and it should be fine. I know if I get any air bubbles or anything similar to that or poking up, I go ahead and I sand it with my 220 sanding block. I wet sand it, so I wet the sanding block, and then I sand the area that I need to be sanded very, very lightly, because if you do not sand it lightly, you might rip up the design or the glitter. So thankfully, I'm doing this on a tack it method, so I don't have to worry about any glitter poking up. All right, so it looks like this is covered. I don't need a thick coat of epoxy because I'm going to be applying a decal and then another coat after the decal. And I take my baby wipe and then I just wipe my finger off so I don't have to keep changing my gloves. So baby wipes are a lot cheaper than gloves, so I make sure I just wipe my finger off. And then once that's wiped off, I go ahead and I take my heat gun and I hit my tumbler on high with the heat gun, and I make sure I hit it for 5 to 10 seconds very, very quickly, back and forth like so. Okay, so I was about 5 to 6 inches away from the tumbler. I do it just enough to thin out my epoxy, but I don't do it as much to actually burn my epoxy. So if you are smelling a funky smell you've never smelled before, it's because you're hitting it with the heat too long and it's actually burning your epoxy. So thinning this out, sometimes it makes the epoxy go to the bottom of the tumbler. So what I always do is I always take my gloved hand and I take one finger and I just smooth it out the bottom after I hit it with the heat gun. This makes sure for me that I have a smooth bottom. A lot of times when I first started, the bottoms of my tumbler was very uneven or wouldn't sit up straight or something like that. So I make sure I do this after I hit it with the heat gun. Welcome back, guys. I am back with my dried tumbler. I let this spin for about 6 to 8 hours, and then I let it dry for 24 hours, and then I placed my decal on my tumbler. It does say Jingle Juice. I did get this decal from Cricut Design Space. I went to their images and I typed in Christmas, and I just found something that I liked. So if you do want to know how to place your tumbler or your decals on your tumbler straight, I do have a video on my YouTube channel. I'll post that link in my description below. It's very, very helpful. So again, I waited until my epoxy was completely dried on my tumbler for 24 hours, because if I placed this decal on my tumbler and I didn't like it, and I did it after like 12 hours, if I go to rip it up, it might take the epoxy off. So make sure your tumbler is on your tumbler or is air drying for at least 24 hours. I've actually let this sit for a couple days. Yes, I'm wearing the same shirt. Yes, I've washed it. Yes, it's a different day. And no, you cannot be like me. So I am sorry. Let's go ahead and start applying the epoxy on the tumbler. So I have my batch of epoxy, and I'm actually doing another tumbler after this. So I have probably 2 ounces in here, but it is mixed. If you do want to know how to mix your epoxy, again, I will be posting a link to my video on how to mix epoxy properly. I'm going to go ahead and hit it with a heat gun. I'm going to turn on my turner, and then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to let the turner spin your way. And then I'm just going to drizzle the epoxy onto the tumbler just like you would if there wasn't a decal on there. So you're doing the same exact way as you would doing the first step of this video. It's nothing special. The only thing that's a little different from this is you do have a decal, so do keep in mind, just put a little bit thicker coat of epoxy onto the tumbler, but nothing too thick. You don't want the tumbler to be noticeable epoxy popping out of the tumbler. So I know sometimes people put a lot of layers of epoxy on their tumbler, and you can see the epoxy sticking out from the lip. So you don't have to go all out with that. So since I did do the tack it method, my glitter did not need to be sanded. It didn't need to be I guess sanded down or anything. There was no bumps or anything, so it was very, very easy to just let this dry and then come back to it, place the decal on, and then epoxy it. And once I finish epoxying this, it's going to be finished. Now, if there are some fish eyes that you do notice, then of course you're going to have to go back and sand this, and then go ahead and re-epoxy it. But if y'all noticed, I got no fish eyes, I got no air bubbles in my epoxy, no air bubbles in my tumbler, because I mixed my epoxy properly and I made sure there was no bubbles. And the reason why I am on this angle of the camera is I'm trying to show you the bottom of the tumbler, so I show you how I do the bottom of the tumbler again. So I have an even amount onto the tumbler, and then I just start spreading it up and down the tumbler. For me personally, there's no rhyme or reason how I apply my epoxy, like which direction. You can pour it on, you can, I don't know, you can put it up, you can smear it on with your finger like so, you can do it up and down, you can do it left and right. To me, I haven't found that it made a difference at the end result. So do whatever makes you feel comfortable. It's going to turn out great either way. And it's just going to be beautiful. It's going to be sparkly, and glitter is always beautiful, so you can't mess up glitter. So I make sure, like, I make sure that my decal is pressed down all the way. So if your decal is not pressed down all the way and you have some air underneath it, epoxy is going to get underneath it. So make sure your decal is pressed down all the way. So right now what I'm doing is I'm looking, as my tumbler is spinning, I'm looking at my decal to make sure it is pressed down. If I do see any air bubbles, that means I need to press it down, and you can go ahead and just press it down while it's under the epoxy, while it's still wet. That is fine. It's not going to hurt the tumbler. So it looks good for right now. So I'm just going to dip my finger, whichever finger you're using. I'm going to dip my finger into the epoxy, and then I'm just going to put it on the bottom like so. And I'm just going to spread it on. And you don't want a lot, and if you see some of that dripped onto the silicone mat, you don't want a lot, because a lot of times when I first started, I had, like I said earlier, I had the tumbler bumpy at the bottom or wouldn't sit up straight, and that's because I put way too much epoxy on the bottom of the tumbler. So I just press firmly onto the tumbler, and I just spread my finger across the bottom like so, and it makes an even coat on the bottom. Now after you have an even coat on your tumbler, or you have the right amount of coat on your tumbler, I'm going to take my Wagner heat gun, and then I'm going to hit it with the heat gun for about 3 to 5 seconds. Since it's a smaller cup, sometimes I hit it a little longer depending on if there's a lot of bubbles. And I'm going to put it about 4 to 5 inches away from the tumbler. Now again, I might have other glitter on this tumbler, so I'm going to turn it on and I'm going to smack it off onto the ground just in case any glitter blows out of it. Don't turn on your heat gun immediately and face it to your tumbler, because sometimes you drop this or you accidentally stick it in glitter, and especially if you're doing like plain cups with no glitter, the minute you turn on this heat gun, it's going to blow whatever's in here and blow it right into the tumbler. So every time you turn it on, the first time you turn it on, make sure you face it somewhere away from your tumbler. And I do fast movements on the tumbler, back and forth. All right, so I hit it with the heat gun. If you start hearing, or I'm sorry, if you start smelling a burning smell or a smell you've never smelled before, turn off your heat gun, put it away from the tumbler, because you are now burning your epoxy. So you do not want to burn your epoxy. So I did not focus on the bottom at all, but now that I hit my epoxy and my tumbler with my heat gun, the epoxy is going to start thinning, and it's going to be a little warm. So it's going to sometimes drip to the bottom. So I'm going to take my gloved finger again, and then I'm just going to run my finger across the bottom of the tumbler once again, and that just gets any of the excess epoxy off the bottom, and any chance of the bottom not being even or one side being thicker than the other side. Right now you might not notice the difference, but once this dries, if you have a big clumpy part right here and you go to sit that tumbler up, it's going to be wobbly and shaky, and it's not going to sit properly. So that's something that I do to make sure it is very even. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to let this dry for I'm going to let this spin for about 6 hours, 4 to 6 hours. It all depends on how much epoxy you have. And then I'll let it air dry for 24 hours, and you are good to go. It is all finished. Now, sometimes with the decal, if you don't get the epoxy on the decal properly, meaning like if the epoxy spreads around the decal, just repeat this step again and it's good to go. So you're fine. Don't freak out if the epoxy does not touch the decal, or it does like a fisheye, or the epoxy spreads out. Re-epoxy this, let it sit, let it dry for 24 hours, and you are all set. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. And if you have any questions, comments, or recommendations for me, go ahead and leave a comment, or you can always reach out to me on my Facebook page. It is my same handle, Miss Kiss Creations. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.